On a cold winter day in 2006, atop London's Citigroup Tower, 5 of the most elite students in England sat around a table, each with a single card in front of them. They were competing in an ultra-secret trading game, all hoping to win a ticket to one of the most prestigious financial institutions in the world. One of these players, with a wild dream of becoming a millionaire, had put everything on the line to get a seat at the table. Gary Stevenson sat collected but out of place at the table, surrounded by 4 other players, each exuding the confidence and polish that comes from a lifetime of privilege. The mysterious host running the game handed a single card to each player and then slowly placed 3 more face down in the center. The game had begun. The rules were simple: bet with other players on the total value of all 8 cards in play. The cards came from a special deck including everything from 1 to 15, a -10, and a 20. Players bet by trading with each other and recording their profits. If you have a low card, you'd probably be making sell bets at a low price because you think the total is low. If you have a high card, you'd probably bet that the total value is higher. Gary appeared to be at a disadvantage as he looked down at his single card labeled -10. As the game progressed, the central cards were revealed. A 13 appeared, then a 14, and finally a 20. The 4 players turned their cards over, revealing a 10, 11, 12, and a 15. Gary had been betting on a low-value deck the entire game when the cards in play were the highest possible values, an impossible probability. To Gary's surprise, the host walked over to him and shook his hand, saying simply, "Welcome to the desk." Growing up in East London, Gary was no stranger to hardship.
This is the front room. This is the biggest room in the house, the nicest room. You can see the sun coming in from the windows. Growing up, it was me, both my parents and my brother and my sister, so it was often pretty crowded in here.
Expelled from his primary school at 16, he seemed destined to follow the same path as many of his peers. But Gary had a gift, a sharp mind, particularly when it came to mathematics and economics. Desperate to finish his education, he sought out a 6th form to attend, only to face rejection after rejection. Gary got creative and reached out to the author of his economics textbook, who was a professor at a nearby school. The professor was impressed and took him in. Gary quickly graduated at the top of his class and was accepted into the prestigious London School of Economics. Overnight, Gary found himself surrounded by the elite, students from billionaire families and royalty from all around the world. Yet, despite his academic prowess, Gary was an outsider. His gritty East London accent and tracksuit-clad appearance stood in stark contrast to the smooth-talking, suit-wearing peers around him. But if there was one thing Gary knew, it was how to turn disadvantages into strengths. By the end of his first year, everyone at LSE knew of his ability. Gary faced an issue when it came to finding a summer internship, though. While his classmates flooded the top financial firms with applications boasting impressive and privileged backgrounds, Gary had little more than his good grades and experience working at a sofa store. It seemed his dream of becoming a millionaire was slipping away until a chance encounter changed everything. A random student, one Gary had never met before, approached him with an opportunity that sounded too good to be true. Citigroup hires 1 trader a year through a card game. I think you'd be good at it, the student said. Gary, with no other options on the horizon, knew this was his chance. A few weeks later, Gary found himself waiting in line to enter the first round of the trading game. He and the other candidates were brought into a room with a large table in the center. Breaking into groups of 5, he patiently waited his turn to have a seat at the table, observing the games before him. Gary was smart, but he also had an edge over these players. The student that told him about the game also explained the rules to him. Gary exploited this and crafted a strategy to guarantee a win in the first round. Gary knew that when his opponents were given the rules of the game, they would immediately calculate the expected value of the cards in play, based on the 1 card that was visible to them. This is a common calculation in probability, and tells you the average of random values. Players calculated that the average value of any card in the special deck was 7.65, meaning the average total value would be 61.2. But since there were only 8 cards in play, if a player was handed a 20, the expected value would jump to 68. That player would then bet that the total value of the deck was high. But Gary knew that this textbook approach was flawed in the real world. When low card holders bet low and high card holders bet high, they were actually revealing which cards they had. Gary simply bought from the low sellers and sold to the high buyers, racking up profits while everyone was glued to their calculators. In the real world, if a big company or hedge fund wants to buy or sell something like a currency, they can't just directly call up a trader and tell them they want to buy it. If they did, the trader would just push the price of the currency up, or go out and buy their own in hopes of pushing the market price up. They instead have to ask what the price is, hiding their intention to buy or sell. The trading game was designed to mimic this phenomenon in financial markets and see how candidates made decisions with limited information. Gary applied this to the trading game and won the first round by a landslide. There were 3 weeks until the final round, and Gary knew his competition would be sharper than what he saw in the first round. He spent his time skipping his classes and obsessively practicing the game with his friends. On the day of the final, Gary found himself sitting on the top floor of the Citigroup Tower in London, surrounded by students from the most elite schools in England. 5 players remained, and a promise of riches at Citigroup was on the line. 5 cards were distributed to the players by the host. Gary turned his card over, revealing a -10, the lowest possible card. He knew the total of the 8 cards would be low, but his strategy was to aggressively bully the market up and sell at a higher price. His strategy began to fail when the other players were quoting even higher prices than he was. It appeared that everyone in the game had a high-value card. He responded to this by quoting higher and higher. He was gaining some hope, but as the center cards were revealed, his odds started to look grim. The first card was a 13, bringing the average total up. The second card was a 14. The final card was a 20, and the 4 other players turned their cards over to reveal a 10, 11, 12, and a 15. Gary somberly turned his -10 card over, knowing he had lost and his chances at an internship were down the drain. Until the host reached out his hand to shake Gary's, announcing him as the winner. He explained that this round was just a test for Gary, who had already won because his scores were so high in the earlier round. They were testing his ability to keep fighting even when the odds were stacked against him. The host revealed his identity as Caleb Zuckman and offered Gary an internship as a Citigroup trader. Gary's journey as a trader began on the start desk, which did short-term interest rates trading. He saw the floor buzzing with fast-paced millionaires, each intensely staring at arrays of monitors and shouting trade offers into their phones. These traders spent all day and night trading foreign exchange swaps, where they would lend out a currency in return for a different currency and profit massively off differences in interest rates. He got to know Caleb Zuckman, the host of the trading game and the head of the desk. He ran the book for the Swiss franc. To Gary's left was JB, who ran the Kiwi book, trading Australian and New Zealand dollars. Over to the right was Billy, betting on horse races. Billy had been at the bank for the longest and was the top trader on the desk. He ran the sterling book, and everyone wanted to learn from him. In between was Hongo, who traded the laborious but highly profitable Euro book. And then there was Spangler, who traded Scandinavian currencies. Through these traders, Gary learned the intricacies of FX swaps, the bread and butter of the start desk. He saw firsthand how they all turned seemingly simple trades into massive profits. And as Gary immersed himself in this world, he began to realize that the path to wealth was within his reach. A year later, after completing his studies, Gary returned to the start desk full-time. The lifestyle was everything he dreamed of and more, dining at London's finest restaurants, partying with celebrities, and crashing in penthouses high above the city. But Gary was merely an observer and was stuck doing administrative tasks while everyone was collecting massive bonuses from their trades. The second most important number to a trader is the annual bonus, but this was tied to their profit and loss, or P&L, how much money they made for the bank during the year. The first most important number. But only traders assigned to a book could get on the P&L. Gary needed a book to trade. He looked at each trader's P&L and saw them each making tens of thousands daily from their trades. But they all shared a common feature. They were all lending out US dollars. He went to Spangler, who traded Swedish krona, to find out more. Each trader on the start desk traded FX swaps, where they would lend out a currency in return for a different currency and collect the difference in interest rates. These interest rates were set by the central bank of each country, some higher and some lower.
The stock market is now down 21%.
Because we're now down 43%.
Completely wiped out.
The Dow traders are standing there watching in amazement, and I don't blame them.
Around this time in 2008, central banks around the world were slashing interest rates to zero in an effort to stimulate their economies. Investment funds or corporations with incomes in one currency and investments in another wanted to buy these foreign exchange swaps to lock in exchange rates and avoid the risk of costly currency movements. The Sturt Desk job was to facilitate these trades and profit off of them, and it found a very lucrative strategy to do so. There was a large premium on lending out US dollars in the long term in exchange for an inexpensive foreign currency. They would then borrow US dollars every day at a low interest rate and collect the difference on the longer term swap. Gary was hardly listening until Spangler asked if he wanted in on a trade, to which Gary happily agreed to. He punched a few numbers into his terminal and before he knew it, ordered a $240 million 3-month dollar to krona swap. Just like that, Gary had become a trader. The next day, Billy screamed at him for trading without understanding the risks, but Gary still wasn't listening. The truth was, the whole desk was doing this on a daily basis, with much greater amounts. By the end of the year, Gary made $700,000 for the bank from this single trade. Now late January, bonus day arrived. As each trader filed into Caleb's office to receive their check, Gary sat at his desk, not expecting to be called in. But after everyone had met with Caleb and left his office with smiles on their faces, Gary was finally called in. Caleb placed a piece of paper in front of him, pointing to a line that said 13,000 pounds. Gary, who didn't even expect to get a bonus, had more money in front of him than he ever had. From a trade he put almost no effort into. He wanted more. But without having a currency book to himself, opportunities for these trades would rarely come across him. Luckily, he had proven himself, and Gary was given the New Zealand book by JB a few weeks later. It was the worst book to trade, but Gary was now on the P&L. The more money he made for the bank, the bigger his bonus would be. Caleb, one of the bank's best traders, suddenly called everyone into his office and announced his retirement. Just 29 years old and was already retiring to go build a house in California. Gary knew he had to quickly learn more from him before his departure. The two sat for lunch and Gary asked him a simple question. What does it take to make 100,000 pounds? Caleb, who laughed at first, realized Gary was serious when his stare didn't budge. He clarified that it was impossible during the first year. Gary, who still wasn't happy with that answer, stared more intently. Caleb told him bluntly, "You need to make $10 million for the bank." Gary returned to his desk and wrote out $12 million on a piece of paper, listing out 5 trades he needed to execute to achieve it. The extra $2 million gave him some leeway to guarantee the 100,000 pound bonus. There was a massive problem with this plan though. Gary ran the New Zealand book. No one made big money from trading New Zealand swaps. Until one day, Caleb's replacement, a man named Chuck Matheson, approached Gary after everyone else had left the office. After some conversation, Chuck asked Gary what he did on the desk. Thinking of a response, Gary asked himself, is this a test? Surely the boss knew what everyone traded. He realized that Caleb used to be the Swiss franc trader, and now that spot was open. He took a gamble and told Chuck that he was the Swiss franc trader. Chuck nodded and returned to his desk. Just like that, Gary now ran one of the most profitable books on the desk. He immediately called up a broker and put in a trade for a $1 billion to franc swap. Trade number 1 on his list was now complete. Gary had a moment of realization. A few years ago, he was working at a sofa store for 40 pounds a day. Now he was trading billions of dollars like it was nothing. Gary gained a new perspective. The truth was, most of these traders weren't geniuses. They were just taking advantage of free money, lending dollars out long-term at 2% interest and borrowing them back every day for free. Traders on the desk were making tens of millions a year from their trades, and they didn't care if things went wrong. They got paid if it went right. If it went wrong, the whole banking system would collapse and everyone would be out of a job. The only logical explanation was to take the risk. By the end of the year, Gary's Swiss franc trade made him over $12 million. When it came to bonus day, he was happily expecting 120,000 pounds from Chuck. When Chuck slid the paper in front of Gary, he saw 395,000 pounds. He was stunned. He thought back to his father working at the post office, and again to his memories of the sofa store. Here he was sitting in front of 400,000 pounds that he fell into from a card game. His life changed forever. He kept going with the goal of becoming a millionaire. But the time of easy money was running out. After the 2008 financial crisis, everybody needed dollars. Nobody had them except banks like Citigroup. This lack of available money jeopardized the global banking system, leading the US Federal Reserve to step in and begin lending US dollars to central banks in other countries through FX swaps. As the Fed did this, Citigroup began making less and less profit off its own FX swaps. It was becoming harder for the bank to make money off the impending doom of the economy. Making things worse for Gary was that bonus day had just passed, meaning that the yearly profit for him and all the other traders reset back to zero. If he lost money on a trade, he had no buffer and his P&L would be negative for the whole company to see. He caught a break around early spring. Gary had become popular among Citigroup and headhunters from other banks by this point for being such a successful trader at such a young age. He got a call from one of the top traders in the New York office who told Gary about an opportunity he discovered after a trip to the Swiss National Bank. He told Gary that the SNB was going to keep interest rates high and asked if he wanted in on his trade. Gary didn't question this valuable news and immediately put $1.2 billion in one-year swaps. To his surprise, a week later, his P&L was flashing red, down $300,000. A few hours later, down $600,000. He called his broker in a panic. He was told to check the SNB's website. In May 2010, Switzerland's currency was rising in value. This wasn't a good thing for the country. If your country's currency goes up too much, everything becomes too expensive. That means expensive meals at restaurants and overpriced hotel rooms, meaning no tourists want to go. No other country wants to buy from your country because exports become too expensive, and they can just buy from a neighboring country that makes the same thing. By lowering interest rates to negative levels, it decreases demand from investors, lowering its value. Gary's problem was that he was betting that the franc's rate would stay at zero, or the dollar rate would decrease. He had lent dollars out for 1.1% more than what he borrowed the francs for. Now the Swiss National Bank was lending Swiss francs at minus 4.5%. Suddenly, his winning trade was now losing him 3.4% on $1.2 billion, costing him $40.8 million if he held on to the trade. Gary realized, however, that regular people would never take a negative interest rate, and the SNB was still accepting daily deposits from commercial banks at 0%. He could borrow dollars at something like 1% and exchange them for francs with the SNB at a 4.5% differential, then leave the francs with the SNB every day for 0%, leaving a 3.5% premium. The problem was, Gary was losing hundreds of thousands by the hour, and if the SNB did the same thing with the overnight market as they did with the 3-month market, Gary's trade would be obliterated. Gary was telling all of this to Chuck, who was coming out of a trance from staring at his computer monitors. Chuck was hesitant, but knew there was no other option. By the next day, Gary was down over $1 million. By the next week, down $8 million, wiping all his profits since January, and bringing his P&L to negative $3.8 million. Then senior management began to call, and Gary was forced to accept the loss and exit the trade. Gary also found out that the New York trader who told him about the position was knowingly offloading his own horrible position onto Gary. Now 2011, Gary's track record allowed him to stay on the desk. Billy had shockingly announced his semi-retirement and would be giving up his Sterling book. A trader from the Euro book was assigned to it, and Gary was asked to fill in the spot and be the junior Euro trader. This was one of the most profitable books. The only other person who made $100 million in a year other than Billy was the previous junior Euro trader. From 2008 to 2010, economies were in recovery from the global financial crisis. At the beginning of 2011, the Sturt desk was now being told by management to bet on economic recovery and bet big. But Gary realized they were all wrong. Countries around the world were spending more than what they were making, and their debts were rising. Regular people still weren't spending money, and the ones gaining were traders like himself. Thinking back to the trading game, Gary saw all of the smartest economists around him quoting textbook models for economies that did not translate to reality. He knew that they were wrong, just like the contestants in the trading game were. In 2011, when everyone was betting that interest rates would normalize and economies would recover, Gary bet the opposite. Gary placed an order for a $700 million one-year instrument called an OIS. The OIS he ordered basically locked him in at the central bank's low rates at the time. If the rates decreased, his position would increase in value. Soon after, an earthquake hit Tokyo, killing 20,000 people. Gary made $11 million. Next, Greece's economy collapsed, then Spain's. followed by Italy's, Portugal's, and Ireland's. Gary's P&L skyrocketed, up $22 million in half a year. The other traders were getting destroyed, some even leaving the desk. Besides the freak earthquake and tsunami, Gary was right when everyone else was wrong. By the end of the year, Gary was up $35 million. Gary turned his bonus check over, revealing £2.5 million. Having just made more money than generations of his family had ever made, Gary began to hate trading. He made most of his money from his disaster trades, betting that the economy would collapse. He saw rich people becoming richer and poor people becoming poorer, and nothing was being done about it. He told his boss he wanted to leave. After hearing this, the same trader that offloaded his position on the Swiss franc trade brought Gary to a fancy dinner.
And my boss takes me out for this dinner, and he told me a story about a trader, a young trader at Deutsche Bank who, nice guy, good trader, wanted to leave. The only problem is, Deutsche didn't really want him to leave, so they went through looked through some of his past trades and his emails, There wasn't really anything in there, but there was enough, There was, enough to take him to court, and he rolled through court for years and years, and eventually the guy was bankrupted. And then he literally said to me, I like you, I think you're a good person, but sometimes bad things happen to good people.
Although Gary had made millions in bonuses, these were not paid out all at once, but instead a portion each quarter. The money still belonged to the bank, trapping many traders including Gary. If Gary left, he had to forfeit his £2.5 million. Gary, forced to stay, was sent to Tokyo in a deteriorated mental state. He continued his disaster trade strategy and continued to make huge amounts of money from it. He kept making attempts to leave, but was shot down each time. Gary started negotiating less and less working hours, eventually just coming into work for 1 or 2 hours before returning home, still not allowed to leave the bank. It wasn't until he tried a new strategy before he made some progress. He started to send crazy emails to executives, sharing cryptic clues on what traders at the bank had done and how those things wouldn't look good in newspapers. A week later, Gary was called into an office with an HR manager, who finally set him free. He didn't actually know what happened behind the curtain. Who was responsible for paying him for a year in Tokyo when he never showed up to the office? How was Caleb allowed to leave but Gary wasn't? It didn't matter to him at that point. Gary had won the game. Gary had gotten into one of the world's top banks through unlikely circumstances, became its best trader, made millions for himself, and left. But what happened with his bonus money? Years later in an English pub, Billy tells Gary, "The day you left, there was a conference call. All the start traders, even management, joined the call, knowing you left that day. There was a moment of silence after it was officially announced that you left, until Chuck blurted out, 'Who won, Gary or Citibank?' Caleb unmuted his phone and said plainly, 'Gary won.' All the traders, even the New York trader who was after Gary, filled the silence with laughter.